Everybody joining in. Let's see. Kundan has said importance of art and community. And Luvena, it's given me time to reflect and pause. Yes, definitely given me time to reflect and pause and enjoy relationships with my wife in our 4-year marriage now. All right, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to What's Your Story? Conversations on Yoga Appropriation. This is your host, Dr. Varun Gandhi. Love and abundance, y'all. So this show is an exploration of our world. We talk about issues pertaining to the South Asian community. But these issues are not just limited to us. They're shared across all communities. The question that I had in my mind is, how can we move the needle, talk about these issues? And one answer is through conversations. When we talk about it, we learn something new. And when we learn something new, we want to share with other people, so we reach out to other people. And we have these uncomfortable conversations. We call this the land of the free, but we don't really have freedom because we're bound by hate, we're bound by shame, by abuse, by rejection, by our differences amongst many, many other chains. And these are the issues that we're talking about in What's Your Story? So in the first few episodes, we covered topics like mental health, colorism, and women's abuse in the South Asian communities across the world. Now, some of our future topics include immigrating to the US, and since we covered women's abuse, we're going to cover men's abuse. Today's conversation is on the appropriation of yoga. What I found out when I was doing some research, that September is National Yoga Month. So that's something in the US, the National Yoga Month. So I thought it would be very fitting to talk about the appropriation of yoga in a month, a celebration that's been created by the very people who are appropriating yoga. So that's why we're having this conversation at the very beginning of September. Before we move on, I want to thank all of our collaborators, the many supporters who have shared our posts on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you all for making this happen. A few quick announcements. This is a safe space. There's no judgment, so please share your experiences or ask your questions without reservation. If you'd like, you can keep your questions anonymous. Also, feel free to ask questions at any time. Whenever you think about it, just type it in the chat and we will answer it during the course of our discussion. Now let's get on to our panelists. So first we have Dr. Shreena Gandhi. She is part of the Religious Studies Department at Michigan State University, where it's primarily teaching classes on religion and race in the Americas. She's writing a book titled A Cultural History of Yoga in the United States, which looks at the impacts of race, gender, and class on how yoga is practiced and commodified in religious and secular spaces. Welcome, Shreena. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey and how you ended up on this path while writing this book and where you are today?
Well, I'm an immigrant to the United States from London. I was born in London. And my family has roots in India and Pakistan. So I consider myself South Asian per se, because we've been gone for so long. And I decided to get my PhD in religious studies. And I got it from the University of Florida, and I focused on religion in the Americas. And one day when I was driving from New York to Florida, I stopped in a hotel and watched, as I was getting ready for bed, watched the show on VH1 called The Fabulous Life. and it was The Fabulous Life of Religion. Usually it was an old show that used to cover like J-Lo and Britney Spears, and so this was religion. So I decided to watch since I was a religious studies major. And one of the religions they covered was yoga. And they showed a picture of the Buddha and how yoga was based in ancient Buddhism. And then they interviewed this white woman who had invented yoga booty ballet. And I just thought there's a story here. So I wrote my dissertation on the history of yoga in the US and how it's been commodified. And then, you know, I had a head injury and some moves, and now I'm just down to writing my book mainly on how yoga has been appropriated. What does cultural appropriation mean? And in my research, I tie it to white supremacy and whiteness. Because when someone becomes white, right, as immigrants came to this country and became white, they made an exchange of culture for power. And in that loss of culture, they look to other cultures, whether it's Black culture in the United States, whether it's Indigenous culture, or whether it's Asian culture, however they see it, whether it's Taekwondo, yoga, foods, etc., to feel that rootedness that they had lost in that process of culture for power.
Very interesting. So we're going to cover more on the history. I'm definitely going to we're going to dive deeper into that history of yoga. So yeah, we'll cover that. Thank you so much for that introduction, for introducing yourself. Our next panelist is Luvena Rangel. She's a plus-size yoga practitioner and senior instructor, and the founder of the Curvy Yogi, which is redefining wellness by embracing diversity and inclusion through accessible, inclusive yoga and wellness that goes beyond stereotypes, where she's creating a safe space for yoga and wellness, regardless of shape, size, physical limitations, or other socio-cultural biases. She is Bangalore's leading educator in yoga, anatomy, and philosophy. Welcome, Curvy Yogi. Can you share your story and how you've been influenced to become this leading educator in Bangalore, where you're redefining wellness and breaking all these stereotypes?
Thank you, Varun. Thank you. You know, when I hear my intro being read out to me, I think it's time to make a new one, because I think something has shifted. Right. So I think this is a good space to start revisiting that description as well. How I came to yoga, or how yoga came to me instead. So I was born and raised in the Middle East. My children are the 4th generation who were born there. And yes, I know. And I moved to India 6 years ago. But unlike many other countries, because in the Middle East, we have a very strong Indian representation and a very strong Indian community. In India, I come from the south of India. I'm from Karnataka. And I grew up actually not knowing anything about yoga. I don't remember any of my family or my friends or my teachers, and I went to an Indian school, ever speaking about yoga, because, and it was unheard of to find a yoga teacher at that point in time. But somewhere, when I was around 9 or 10, we had this huge Leeds punch-holed photocopied book that arrived at home, and we don't even know who brought it home, because my mom wouldn't practice it or whatever, because the book was 30 days to yoga, or learn yoga in 30 days. And we have no idea who brought that book home, but I found it. And I practiced yoga, just reading those instructions. It's a different thing that I never got past day 7. And then I would keep going back to day 1 to day 7. But that was my first introduction to yoga. And I continued one way or the other, you know, over the years. But I think my first dip into it was as a body practice. I didn't know anything about the philosophy. There was no sign or explanation of the spiritual background of it, but somehow it happened. And years later, when I had a severe back injury and I was bedridden, the only thing that helped me was yoga. And that was only because it was advertised as yoga for weight loss. And that's how I approached it. That was in Dubai. That was many, many years later when yoga teachers were, they were still just flourishing. They were not flourishing, they were just mushrooming around the place. And you might know, there was some of the schools, some of the studios that just opened up in Dubai. But about 6 months into the practice, I realized that I wasn't looking at the weight anymore. I wasn't looking at the weight. I was thinking very differently. My yoga teacher was teaching me very differently. And I started really looking into what it was that was happening with my body, with my mind, how I was thinking. And spirituality happened. It was almost like an awakening of sorts. Not a big aha moment, but it's just the way of thinking, how I interacted with people. All of that changed and shifted. And that's where I began my study, the actual study, not just imagining things, but saying, no, this must be having roots somewhere. There must be a place to study this. So that's how I got into the practice. But when it comes to breaking stereotypes, the reason it came about was because there was no other practitioner that looked like me, and there was no other teacher who looked like me. There was no other teacher who spoke about how to do things when your body is supposed to imitate a book which had a rubber band body on it. And I said, how do I do this? I'm never going to do it, because the focus was still a lot on the body and what the body could do, very little on what the mind is supposed to do. So that's where I started looking at things very differently and understood that the asana part was a very tiny part of the whole thing. And wellness involved so many other factors that didn't involve doing a highly contorted body shape or posture that just wasn't possible. So I began looking at it as an inclusive space when it looked at not just, initially it started just with the body, the shape and the size and the accessibility. And eventually I was also working in the corporate world. So even though I do come with a background in medicine, but I was working for a multinational organization which had this filter of all these values that they speak about in corporate organizations. So I said inclusivity. I needed to know what inclusion was. And as an NRI, we are faced with being excluded all the time. So we know, I knew what that felt like. So it was easier for me when I came to India and see that Indian yoga studios, because there's still studios here, were no different from anywhere else, because you still don't have teachers who really look like me, at least not in the ones that are in the limelight or in the media. So that's where I started. And I said, well, it's time for people to know that yoga isn't about having a super flexible yoga teacher or an asana teacher, but really someone who teaches a little bit deeper, goes a little deeper and helps people reclaim their roots, reclaim where we come from, who we are, and teach that. So that's why I said, I think it's time for me to change my profile and speak about yoga a little differently and speak about who I am a little differently now.
Definitely. That's going to be the first question. So we're going to come back to that. We're going to dive deeper into what you just said about what is yoga, and how you redefine your relationship with yoga. So it's a very important point that I do want to bring up. So we'll come back to that. But let me get to Kundan really quickly. Hey, Kundan. Kundan Chhabra is an Indigenous anti-racism activist and multi-creative storyteller, where he uses storytelling, creativity, and Akashic record readings to create a transformation on both the individual and systemic levels by changing the narrative. They're Punjabi, Indigenous, ethnic, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh. And they currently reside in Orange County, Southern California. Welcome, Kundan. You have a very interesting story growing up. And so can you share that story? Can you share the racism that you faced when you were growing up and how those experiences have brought you onto your current path?
Yeah, so my own body is a constant reminder of that, right? It's, in my case, it's actually both racism and colorism and how the two kind of almost merged. And the birth trauma that I experienced is because of neglect from racism and colorism, because although my mom is quite fair skinned, my dad is more on the darker side as far as skin color. And I grew up in Myanmar, which the colonizer name for the country is Burma. And it's in Southeast Asia. And in that country, in 1962, a light-skinned, like Chinese, kind of like Chinese heritage dictator staged a coup and took over the country. He took over the TV station first, and then, basically declared himself the leader of the country, and he was a military general. And then he started. One of the first things he did was to kick out the foreigners, and the foreigners in this case were Indians mostly, and some Pakistanis as well, mostly brown people. And then he slowly started creating rules such as foreigners must carry FRC, which is foreigner registration cards, and then citizens carry national registration cards, like Burmese people. And the rules started becoming more and more strict. Like my mom was never allowed to have her medical degree because she was deemed a foreigner. They seized my grandfather's assets because they called it nationalization. So that was the socialist aspect of it, but it wasn't real socialism. It was just a dictatorship, and they were just doing whatever they wanted, flexing their power. And so I was born into all of that, 20 years later, approximately in 1981. And the nurse, was very neglectful, and I was born feet first. And she just pulled at me and twisted my ankle and possibly my spine as well. And it would have been fine if I had an operation immediately. And again, possibly because of the racism and colorism, I'm not sure why I didn't get the operation that I needed until I was 4 years old to fix that. So by that time, it was already kind of almost too late, right? And then I needed another operation when I was 13 because I couldn't wear slippers, and I was starting to have coughing problems, and they couldn't figure out why at first, because apparently when they did the x-rays, I had no viruses, no bacteria. And then they realized it was something to do with my bone structure. And so they did an operation to fix my spine, at least a little bit. And then they also grafted my nerves from my thighs onto my toes so that I could move my toes, so that I could wear slippers on my left toes. And to this day, though, like my left foot is significantly smaller than my right, which is why growing up, my dad had to get me customized shoes. And so moving to America, that was not a problem where I could never buy the right shoes even, it's a struggle just to find the right shoes. It's a struggle to find the right pants. I often have had to go to the boys section because I'm also short, because my growth was stunted because of all that. And then on the colorism side, it's funny to me that here I'm considered brown, because there I was basically considered dark or black, because we were literally called kala, which in Burmese means black. And sometimes we were called kwe kala, which means black dog. And so that's where it started. And then, of course, there was all of the marketing from the United States telling us that it's the land of freedom and opportunity, and I believe that. So my intention to come to the United States was to be free from all of that, but this has the same problems, but it's a lot more covert, which is actually worse, as I learned over the years. Because when something is covert, there's a gaslighting effect, because physical, it's hard to bring it up, and when you do, they deny it, and then they demonize you for it. They call you, they say you're judging them. In fact, I had a white woman recently say, I'm judging her for the color of her skin. And that is what we call reverse victimhood, right? So over the years, I've had to learn to document all of those psychological weapons of manipulation, and especially narrative warfare. And that is when my interest in storytelling came um, into place as well, because the narrative is the key to all of this. And I studied storytelling really deeply. I even started studying things that most of the population have never heard of, such as open loops, closed loops, and even nested loops. Open loops and closed loops are how TV serials keep us hooked in between commercials to keep watching by creating an open loop. And this has an actual psychological and neurological effect. And then nested loops are how they commit inception. They program you with seeds of ideas. So Inception is not just a movie to me. It's almost like a documentary or a metaphor. So so there's all of that. That's how I come into this. Yeah.
Interesting. So then you came to America after that, and you saw all of the kind of the covert practices that are going on over here, right? All right, cool. So that's what we're going to cover later on in this, and how that's related to yoga. So, all right, this is, yoga appropriation. But I feel like before we get to the appropriation part, I think we should talk about what is yoga. So Luvena, I'm going to ask you that question. What is yoga?
The short answer is yoga is not what everyone thinks it is. Yoga is not the asana bit. Yoga is not the complex, twisted image that comes up the first time you Google it. Google yoga and you see bodies twisted in all sorts of shapes, yoga wear, advertisements, all of that. You search for a yoga teacher, and you don't see anyone who looks like any of us on this screen either. So yoga isn't any of that. Most people come into yoga thinking that it is body work, that it is exercise, that it is something that's going to build flexibility. And maybe it does in a way, it has its place, but it is not yoga as it is, right? It is one part of it. It is just the body part of it. But what yoga is you really have to look at it through the context of who's asking the question and who's answering it. What do you mean by yoga when you give a definition? And where are you quoting it from? Where is the source from? So so normally if you ask anyone, even if it's say maybe in a teacher training program and a brand new student who hasn't done anything, and they say, do you know what yoga is? And they say, yes, we've Googled it and we know that yoga is union. I say, union of what? Right? And then they stumped, because then they come up with all sorts of stories, some of them, and they mix cultures and they mix different contexts and mix different scriptures to give a definition. And then you have the other series of definitions, because yoga is what feels right to me. Yoga is what I make out of it. And all of those are the no-no-nos, because yoga comes from a place which, if you look at it as a philosophy, it is one of the 6 major philosophies of India, or of the Hindu system. And it is, there is a perspective to it. That's why it's called a darshana. So it's the same truth that you're looking through different perspectives, different lenses. And yoga is one of the ways in which you seek that truth, one of the ways in which you look at things. So if you look at a very technical definition, then you've got the sutras, the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which give us one definition. If you look at it in the Bhagavad Gita, then there is a different way in which how yoga is defined. So it really depends on all of that. And I think we have gone through so much of simplifying and diluting the definition of yoga that I think it's high time we start complicating it, and we start making it or making the effort to take time and define what yoga is. Yoga isn't, Varun, it isn't what Luvena wants it to be. It cannot be that. I may apply principles of different scriptures and different ways of looking at things to make sense in my life. But defining it according to Luvena would be blasphemous in a way, You know, it would be wrong, because sages before us, you know, have done the hard work, which I am not even capable of doing at this point in time. They have done the work to define what it is. There is a definition. So it, it is painful when we have a very whitewashed definition of what it is, because so we are having this conversation in English, which means that most people look at, you know, having a definition of English derived from different English translations of translations of translations of translations, which means it's already diluted and people don't really know. And then they mix and match from these different commentaries to say, this version of what yoga is something that I enjoy because it doesn't ask me to do the hard work. It doesn't ask me to dig deeper and look at, you know, all these things. So yoga is not a psychology. Yoga is not a feel-good factor. Yoga is not supposed to, you know, make you feel completely relaxed and my body feels so flexible that I can have a good night's sleep. No, yoga is supposed to disturb you a bit. Yoga is supposed to present those difficult things that are getting unclogged from your mind and your body. And if we market it that way, yoga is not going to be the big multi-billion industry that it is in the West right now. But long story short, there is no one answer to what yoga is. It is an experience. It is a path to spiritual evolution. It is one of the darshanas, and it requires effort. It does not require a yoga mat. It doesn't require yoga pants or a name. It requires your earnest, quiet tapas on the route, on the path. It requires that discipleship and respect. I think that's what yoga is.
So I think we
according
have
to me.
Okay. No, I totally understand. And so it's more than the physical, and I think that's, you know, that's one of the, I guess, Westernized yoga has made it more about that physical aspect. And one of the main points that I wanted to drive here is that it's more than just that physical aspect. There's a whole lot more to yoga. So we have a question from the audience, and I think that's really a good time to answer that question. Simone is asking, I've been interested in learning yoga training, but have been so put off from the teachings that are out there. What yoga training would you recommend that is most authentic at this time? So Luvena, if you want to, or Shreena, let's go with Shreena if you want to answer that, and then we can go to Luvena as well.
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that
No,
question,
okay.
as
All right,
I've done yoga training. Yeah.
all right, Luvena, let's go.
This is tricky because although I do teach yoga teacher trainings, I am coming to the point to, you know, of openly saying that yoga teacher trainings are just another marketing strategy. I don't believe that, you know, I wouldn't recommend anyone. I would recommend that you find your teacher. Now that's a bit difficult and that's tricky. If it comes to curriculum, you know, then you just go as a consumer, and then you're looking at what is your best value for your money, and that wouldn't justify as a dharmic answer even to say, you know, what is the right yoga teacher training to have. But Simone, I would say that if you're really looking for something authentic, then you really need to question what is authenticity to you. You know, is it someone who is presenting things in a way that makes you feel good? Or is it someone who's so true to the source of the teachings that they fall back on those truths, that they fall back on those, the scriptural context, the nuance, the culture. There's a lot to yoga and learning what yoga is than just knowing how to pronounce the, you know, the asana names in Sanskrit. So I don't think I have the right answer for what yoga training would do. I myself, I'm just a yoga sadhak forever. I'm a disciple. I'm a yoga practitioner forever and ever and ever. So whatever you learn, even if you don't do a yoga teacher training, will still keep you on the path. Sorry, I think my answer doesn't really answer your question in its entirety. But I think that's where I come from. That yeah.
So Luvena, could we say that maybe trying out different yoga, practitioners, like
Yeah.
getting a taste of what everyone's offering, and then maybe making a decision based on that.
Yeah. Okay. So I do have something to say in that. Sorry, Kundan. I'll just quickly say. So you see, yoga is not a one-way road, right? Not everyone goes to yoga, and not everyone does the same thing. Yoga has so many different ways of expression. Some people, based on what our karma is, based on what our swadharma is, based on what we are called to do in this lifetime, we may approach yoga through bhakti. Some others may approach yoga through jnana. Some may approach through karma yoga, and some may just go through Raj yoga, where that's their sole focus. So everyone has that different expression. So it really calls for introspection, to being in satsang and being in community with so many teachers, to say, what is it that resonates with me? What is my path on yoga? And then you take it. So not everyone needs to do a hatha yoga teacher training to learn asana and learn to teach 50 different asanas. Sometimes just 3 asanas, because eventually you just need to learn how to sit. So, I think it needs that exploration. Before you start wanting to be a teacher, you need to know what your practice looks, feels, embodies like. So
Basically, what feels most authentic to the person.
yes.
Follow that path. Very good. Yeah. Thank you, Simone, for that wonderful question. She says, I'm just tired of the marketing of yoga and it's not being presented for its true essence because it's so whitewashed. I'm interested in the spiritual journey of it. Hey, Kundan, you had something to add. Go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to add what Luvena said also, when she said about searching for a teacher. It reminds me of like so many mythologies, right? About the student climbing a long and steep mountain looking for their teacher, right? And the teacher is usually hiding in a cave with a small door. And when the student knocks on it and the teacher opens, at first the teacher literally like slams the door on the student, and the student has to prove themselves to the teacher. And you see even Western movies like Star Wars or Doctor Strange kind of modeled that template. And it's often known as the call, the refusal of the call, and then acceptance of the call. And this happens both ways. Like afterwards, when the teacher finally accepts the student, the teacher will say, "You have a call. You have something to do," and then the student will refuse it, and then the teacher will show like what's at stake if you refuse, and then you accept the call. So it's like a very big and deep thing going on. And this whole commodification of yoga has really diluted even that process of finding the right teacher for us, because teachers are everywhere and you just pay, $17 an hour and you get your teacher. It's so easy, right? And that's not how it's supposed to be.
That analogy reminds me of kind of like when we were looking for a mate. That's kind of what happens too. Like, you have,
Right.
that's the advance.
Now we got Tinder, right? We got the app.
Exactly. The same thing. So, okay. Thank you for adding that, Kundan. Definitely love that point. So yoga in the Western field we just covered has put more of a focus on this physical aspect. So I want to bring this question to Dr. Gandhi, Shreena. How did it come to this point? What is that historical perspective of yoga in the US and how did it get
Right. Thank you. So what I have found is that the first Indian kind of missionaries, if you will, that brought yoga over, obviously we start with Vivekananda and then Yogananda. They actually brought yoga over more as a meditative practice, right? Again, focusing more on the pranayama part of yoga. And both of them, Vivekananda directly said that you don't have to convert to anything to practice yoga, that yoga is complementary to Christian practice. So what he would say is, he would say, you know, in your bedroom or something, create a space to do yoga and do the breathing exercises. And he was actually really successful in selling yoga this way. He raised a lot of money. And his audience was mainly white women. And so white women really have been the main audience of yoga in the United States. And Yogananda did this too. Then later you had white men and white women, as well as Indian yogis, start to teach yoga as asana as well. And the reason they did this is because it created, you know, there is some people who practice yoga and create a certain type of body, right? And so if you look at like the Atlanta Constitution Journal, for instance, or the New York Times, you would see articles about starting in the 1930s, 1940s, where they start to show yoga as a thing for weight loss, right? And again, marketing mainly to women. So in the 1960s, there was this guy by the name of Richard Hittleman, who wrote a book like 28 Days to Weight Loss, or Yoga for Housewives. And, you know, they showed doing yoga while like vacuuming, right? Or doing yoga while sitting in the office. And this was really a change, because in the early 1900s, when Vivekananda and Yogananda were kind of like the two main figures in terms of the practice, the kind of Indian face of the practice of yoga, they got into trouble. They were vilified for kind of preying on white women. And but yet they were very successful with the white women, right? It was mainly kind of white men that were very anxious about white women's bodies being, you know, taken in by brown men. And, you know, as you know, in the history of this country, a black man looked at a white woman the wrong way during this time period, they were lynched, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So around the 1930s, 1940s, you have this transformation from kind of a Raja yoga, meditative type yoga, to an asana, physical type yoga. And then it kind of just ballooned from there into what we see today. And so that's kind of a little bit of the history. But from the beginning, people like Vivekananda were very conscious that they couldn't come here and convert people because of the kind of very deep Christianity that was here. And so they presented yoga as something that is complementary to Christian practice. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that does. That does. That gives a great historical perspective. And so when yoga came over, it had to be presented in such a way. So that's why they put it in that perspective. So now, from there, how did so then what is yoga appropriation? From that question, what is yoga appropriation? Like, what are the different forms of it, Shreena? What are the different forms of it? What are the signs of it?
Right. So actually, I'd like to take you back a little bit further to Henry David Thoreau and Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophy movement, and Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalist movement. And right around the early 1800s, you start seeing books from India translated, as Luvena said, into English, and you know, making its way over to the United States. And Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson get their hands on the Bhagavad Gita, as well as the Vishnu Purana. And Henry David Thoreau reads the Bhagavad Gita and is very, very inspired by it, and writes about how he imagines himself on doing yoga on the banks of the Ganges while he's at Walden Pond, right? It's not really clear what he was doing, because anyone that's read the Gita knows that it's not a how-to book of how to move your body per se, or how to necessarily practice yoga, right? It's a bigger book than that, or a bigger part of the Mahabharata than just that, right? It's not a how-to guide. And so what I do in my research is look at someone like Henry David Thoreau or the Theosophists that use, again, the trope of Raja Yoga without really understanding what it is, or kind of their imagination of what it is, I should say. And again, I tie this to the process of becoming white, right? Again, you know, when people read about Henry David Thoreau, they don't read about him as a white man and what that means. And that's part of the white supremacy that has infused our institutions and our histories, right? So my goal is to write him as a white man, and what does that mean? And as he's white, why is he interested in imagining yoga or imagining India really as this spiritual place where everyone is, you know, a sadhu, and it's exotic, it's spiritual, it's not moving forward, and he imagines the West as kind of the opposite. And so you have these tropes of East and West that emerge during this time that still kind of follow us to this day. And so that's another topic. But, you know, looking at Thoreau, looking at Madame Blavatsky, looking at other theosophists and transcendentalists, like, as white, and then you better understand why they're looking to a kind of timeless, exotic in quotes, imagination of a culture to root them, right? And that's why you get cultural appropriation, especially among white people, because I think that the very process of becoming white is a loss, right? And so they're looking to fill that loss up. And they do it by exploitation, through capitalism, through colonialism, and through Orientalism. I think you see it today as well as, you know, 200 years ago.
Yeah, that's been the trend for the last so many years. Okay, so Luvena, what have we seen on in India that you know, for the commercialization part? So I guess there are two parts. There's a sterilization of yoga, and then there's a commercialization of yoga. So let's talk about how is yoga being sterilized. We can give specific examples of that.
Yeah, I think it begins with history. It begins with history where Indians themselves were penalized for practicing anything that empowered them. So it's got a lot to do with power dynamics. And it's not just yoga. We're talking about any of our indigenous works of wisdom or lineages of traditional craft as well, including Ayurveda or Siddha or any of these things. Any of our ancient wisdom traditions have all been almost decimated. What remains today is just a handful of it. But with the colonization came also the conditioning of the people to believe that what was their indigenous heritage and their heritage wisdom was not good enough, because there was something easier and better and more lucrative in anything that was outside, that was foreign in a way. So if we come to yoga as a practice, and this is still not the spiritual part of it, now, I don't have a lot of the fact to give the numbers, but what I do know from a lot of experiences is that a lot of the indigenous lineages, the traditional lineages, have still maintained themselves in different pockets of the country through villages and their families, and they continue. What, however, is the commercial bit of yoga? It's again blossoming or blooming in India now. And the way I call this is a repackaged, re-importing of what we exported or what we could have exported, what was stolen from us. I don't shy from saying it was stolen, because it was. And it was taken there, it was repackaged, it was redone into so many different ways. And it breaks my heart now that if I had to just look up for yoga teachers in India, even if I have to look at just in Bangalore where I am right now, most of the yoga is asana based. It looks like it's not I won't be surprised if any of the trademarked yoga practices or yoga programs in the US are now available in India, where everyone wants to buy a yoga program. They want to buy the latest thing. They want to buy jade yoga mats, and they want to buy all these things. And what's even more heartbreaking is that there's just a tiny fraction of people who are actually doing the work of studying the scriptures, keeping the tradition alive, keeping, or tapping into the spiritual foundation of what yoga is. So what does it look like right now? It looks whitewashed in India as well. It does. In fact, if we look at, all of a sudden we've got the yoga capitals in India. And those yoga capitals of India, if we go to Rishikesh, we know that most of the people are there to take, give them 500 rupees and all of a sudden they'll do a puja for you, and they'll give you a bottle of Ganga Jal, and, they'll do all of these things. There is authenticity there, but the capitalism hasn't snuck. It's just so there in front of us that it's all over. So it is painful to find something very new. And the glamour of it, when it comes to celebrities, it's something that I really, it's painful to say the least, when we have people with influencers on social media who present yoga to be everything that it is not. All those things that we spoke about, when it comes to get that perfect yoga body and get your 6 packs in yoga. Yoga teachers do we need to have 6 packs? But it doesn't. There is a revival. There is scope, but we need to really work hard to keep the authenticity. It is uplifting. There are many schools, but unfortunately, there isn't that much of support for it, because the prize goes to people who have the glossy magazines and the money for the advertisements and the one who can promote the ads on social media. But the ones who are really doing the deep work, the ones who are keeping tradition alive, the ones who are doing the spiritual study, they don't get funded, so no one hears about them. So I don't want to paint a very, very bleak picture, but I'll paint a painful picture, because that is what's happening in India right now.
Wow, that is reality, right? You're, I guess, talking about facts, what you see, what you observe. That reminds me, like when I was growing up, there was this shoes that everybody wanted to get. This really, really nicely designed, really sleek, really expensive looking shoes, like really good quality, the Nike. And that's what yoga is right now. It's like everybody wants to jump in because it's so just shiny, and it's like that thing that everybody wants to be part of, but they don't realize what they're actually getting part of, what it really means. So Kundan, I know you have, in just one instance, recently you shared with me about how you called out somebody for yoga appropriation. And that's just one instance. I know you've done that many, many other times. So can you share from your experience what you have seen, and how do you handle that, something like that?
Right. Well, before I do that, I also want to again speak to the narrative warfare that white people wage against us whenever we bring up appropriation and fight for our culture. And they use a lot of cognitive biases and logical fallacies, such as false equivalence, false dichotomies, reverse victimhood, ad hominems, and red herrings. So especially with the red herrings, when they bring up a false thing to derail us, is they would, for example, often bring up, what about, cultural appreciation and exchange? What's the difference, right? Which to me is a red herring at this point, because sometimes I even say sarcastically, like, but also it's true, like, when you guys give us back 400 years of systemic power, then we can talk about appreciation exchange. Right now, we're not doing that. And then alternatively, they would ask questions like, oh, why are you not willing to share, as if culture is property, right? Which is a very capitalist classist mindset. Or they would ask, oh, why aren't we allowed to do this, to wear feathers on our hair or whatever, or to have locks, right? Or to do yoga, to say namaste. And again, that's a red herring, and it's also reverse victimhood because which is their number one psychological weapon. They will demonize us and then cry victim, even though they're the ones oppressing us. And it's also a very, interestingly enough, I realized that it's also what narcissists use, which is why a lot of my Black teachers, my Black anti-racism educators have said that we are in a narcissistic relationship with white supremacy because they use the same weapons, basically. And so coming back to why are we not allowed, which is what white people ask, that again is a false, derailing question to ask because white people are fully allowed to do whatever they want. They're fully allowed to actually appropriate our culture because the entire system allows them. And in fact, it actually raises their status. So for example, Black women are not allowed to let their hair grow naturally on the way it's growing, right? They're fired from their jobs, they're discriminated, etc. Whereas when a white woman does it, not only are they fully allowed, it actually raises their status. They're seen as cool, right? Similarly, the Hawaiian language was illegal until the 80s. Meanwhile, white people to this day fully uses words like aloha, etc. And even recently, a few years ago, this big white corporation was suing mom and pop Hawaiian restaurants and shops for trademark infringement for using the word poke in the restaurant name, which is a traditional Hawaiian food. The irony of that, right? It really infuriates me when I think about the levels of reverse victimhood here in that question. So I want to really speak to that. And this is why in these conversations, I've never seen a single white person hold themselves accountable. They always gaslight. They always use this method of reverse victimhood. And by the way, the term gaslighting, for people who don't know, is from a I believe in 1942 or 1944 film called Gaslight, where the husband wanted the family jewels when the wife's aunt or grandmother died. And he started driving the wife crazy by doing little things like dimming the gas lamp up and down. And when the wife asked, hey, what happened to the light? He would say, what light? Nothing happened. So it's completely denying her reality. That's what gaslighting is. It's emotional abuse because it makes you think you're the one that's crazy.
Interesting. And can you share the most recent experience, the one you
Oh,
had?
right. So that's an example of the fact that, like I said, I've never had a white person hold themselves accountable, but I've had Black people and also brown people hold themselves accountable. And this most recent one, we've had things like goat yoga, beer yoga, etc. And I saw this Filipino woman combine her own Filipino traditional culture with yoga and come up with something called Wayang. I can't even pronounce this right. Something Haya Yoga, right? Walang Haya Yoga. And so there were two things problematic with that, right? First of all, in my understanding, I'm not a yoga expert per se, and maybe Luvena and Shreena can confirm this for me. But my understanding is that hatha, like yoga is not supposed to be combined with anything unless it's already in the original lineage, such as, for example, hatha yoga, then that's fine. But coming up with things like disco yoga, for example, is completely diluting the lineage. Yeah, they have all sorts of yoga, and they have cannabis yoga, even drunk yoga, which is yeah, it's so speechless when I saw that, because they're total opposites. And anyway, so when I saw this, so the first thing was it's not supposed to be combined. And even if she had said, Waya, Walanghaya and yoga or with yoga, that would have been better, right? And the second thing was it makes it sound like she had completely invented a whole new type of yoga, similar to beer yoga and goat yoga when you do that. And so first I just contacted you as well as a few others, as well as my mentor, whom I consider my elder. And there was one person who didn't want me to even do anything about it because she only wanted me to exclusively call out or call in white people and didn't want to call out other ethnicities. And I'm like, we have to fight for every break because the walls are closing in on us, you know, because because she's probably going to be teaching white people too. And now if it's okay for a brown person to do this, it makes white people even more permission to do something like this. But because she's brown, I didn't want to publicly call out. And I checked in with my community, with my elders, and the majority said, just DM her, which is what my intuition was saying too, So I privately said, hey, this is basically it was I tried to be very kind and considerate because just a fellow brown person. I said, this sounds like appropriation to me because of this reason. The word yoga is not supposed to be combined with anything. And I checked in with my community and my elders, and they kind of agree. And some of them said, just DM you, and this is why I'm doing this. And at first, she was a little bit defensive, but I didn't reply. And then maybe it was good that I was silent for a few minutes. And then her later messages were like, actually, I'll change the name. It wasn't my intention, but I understand that impact trumps intention. Like she already understood this concept, which is a basic concept that many white people don't, which by the way is why I say, brown and black people are more likely to be held accountable because they already understand the basic concepts. I don't have to re-explain that. And finally, she agreed that she'll just call it Walang Higher Flow, like she won't even put the word yoga in it. So we came to that agreement.
Okay, so what did she change it to then?
Just like the Filipino word with the word flow, and that was so the word yoga is not even in it. Like,
okay, got it.
Yeah.
So I really loved how you handled that. It was very, very kind, very peaceful, and that's why I wanted you to bring that example up to set a model for how other people can, it's not calling out, but it's saying what it is. So saying that this is
right. It's the difference between calling out and calling in. I think calling out is when you do it publicly, and calling in is when you do it privately and say, hey, kind of bringing them home is how I see it. Because I think deep down, all brown and black people are indigenous, but that had our indigenous roots cut off and erased from us. So it's like calling people home,
Very well put. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that example. All right. So, and so Luvena, have you seen any other? Actually, you know what? Let me get to Shreena first. Shreena, how else can we support, this or discourage the appropriation of yoga? What else can we do? What else can the audience do to discourage this act?
Well, I don't know that, I actually did recently write an article on goat yoga, rage yoga, and trauma yoga for a religion magazine. I don't know that we can necessarily stop it. I think capitalism is is like a monster train just raging ahead. And if we want to stop the appropriation of yoga, of other cultures, we have to dismantle capitalism. And I think that's a long-term project. And dismantling capitalism is a part of dismantling white supremacy. So it's a long-term project. And I don't know that it's going to happen in my lifetime. I I can hope, but I also have to realize the ways in which I'm complicit in capitalism as well, and undo that. And it's a lifelong struggle for me, you know. So what I would say though is, and what I, you know, when white yoga practitioners ask me, I say do a little bit of research, right, and acknowledge that, you know, yoga has multiple roots in South Asia, right? If we look at the history, we see, you know, Hindu yoga, we see Jain yoga, Buddhist yoga. When Sikhism became a religion, you see them, you know, so yoga is to me kind of part of the foundation of South Asia, just as other things are, right? Like if you look at horrible things like caste, that's foundational to South Asia, and that's something that we have to dismantle as well and really, you know, work against. And so that takes intention. And so that's kind of the simple answer that I tend to give people is do a little bit of research, look at the ways in which yoga has a history in South Asia, and look at why yoga in particular came over to the United States and to Europe and kind of went over all over the world, as opposed to, let's say, the goddess Kali, right? And so which forms of South Asia, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, of Jainism are acceptable to the powers that be, to the colonizers, and which parts aren't? So I think just to look at South Asian culture a little bit more holistically is also important. And then to also, as a South Asian, as someone who, even though I'm mixed caste, has a Savarna name, to look at the ways in which I hold certain types of privilege, and then to, you know, dismantle that. And I see something about Sufi yoga. Yes, Sufis, when they came to South Asia, also had a form of yoga. So, you know, I think if you look at South Asia prior to colonization, there was a lot of exchange, a lot of mixing, etc. And I think colonization, there's something different about European colonization that that we're still dealing with today, whether it's in South Asia, whether it's in Southeast Asia, various parts of Africa or South America, Latin America, we're still kind of dealing with it.
What are, you know, when you say that there are some palatable parts and then some things that are being left out, what are some of those things that are not being transferred over, that are being left out, that people cannot handle? Are there some specific kind of maybe, you know, some sort of concepts that they're leaving out?
Well, I mean, if you look at, you know, yoga, it's something that can be transformed and used and commercialized. Whereas if you look at a lot of the rituals of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Jainism, those are kind of ignored. Whether it's, you know, the Abrahamic religions in general have a bias against murtis, or anthrocentric depictions of the gods. I think I said that the right way, or human depictions or bodily depictions, right? And so we were often called idolaters for having statues. You know, I have a statue of the Buddha here. If you look over there, there's Ganesh. And so I think those are the things that initially were seen as bad. And then, you know, you don't really see, unless it's like certain types of white feminists, people kind of embracing Kali. And then when they do, as a white feminist, it's kind of a weird appropriation and not really realizing who she is, and kind of focusing on you know, how they can use Kali to empower themselves, rather than the kind of larger context of Hindu mythology. So I guess I would say those things, like you don't see many people becoming sadhus and renunciating everything, you know, but the roots of one of the roots of yoga is in that tradition of renunciation. And you don't really see that because that's unpalatable in a capitalist system.
Yeah, that did. So that's basically going against the whole system of capitalism. If you renunciate capitalism, then you're gonna, it can't exist anymore. So they can't have that. Right, Kundan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Luvena, what have you seen that are the unpalatable parts that are not being taught, that are not being transferred over in this whitewashed yoga?
Everything. Everything, because they look, there's a lot of selective choice making. There's a lot of cherry picking. There's a lot of individualism in the whole. When Kundan said that we have to fight brick for brick to reclaim our culture, that's exactly what it is. Because culture, if I speak about India or even this, the entire subcontinent, it's very rich and very diverse, and you cannot bottle it like pickle and say this is what culture is. It isn't. It's diverse. It shifts from, a mile down the road you'll find so many different ways of even if it's cooking or the way you sing or the way you narrate a particular a story, a legend, any of those things. And both when it comes to yoga and the culture, or what is shown or what is showcased, or what is depicted according to the Western perspective, is just one tiny unnuanced, or it's sterilized, it's removed from its original context, which can be very diverse and presented in a way that that is not indigenous. So that in itself is one aspect. Like when someone says about Kali, when you speak about goddess Kali, then it's a very it's not even a multi-dimensional, it's just a 2D version of what one person might have inferred it to be. But as we know, any of the gods and goddesses, or even the demigods in Indian mythology, they've got multiple facets of why they are portrayed as such. And to assume that, say for example, a Ganesha idol is just supposed to be, cute little elephant god is not what it is. And Ganesha is not only there to eliminate obstacles. There are so many other facets of Ganesha, which when people want to place his idol in whichever space, they need to know what they're doing. They need to they need to acknowledge that wholeness and that richness, which people are just not seeing. So when it comes to any of these practices, the way I see it is that all of our practices, all of our wisdom traditions of the country or of the subcontinent are deeply rooted, like Shreena also said, in our culture. It is. You cannot remove the two. They are integrated into each other. Our religions are integrated with the different states we come from, the way we practice, the way we celebrate festivals. All of them are very different, and that is the richness of it. That's the diversity. If that context is removed, then you're just removing a bit of its soul, and then it is appropriation, because you've removed the nuance from it, you've removed the bhava from it, you've removed the shraddha from it, you've removed all of these things from it, and you've just bottled it and packaged it as Indian culture. And some of us can't really put them into words. What is it that we feel? In very simple terms, I would feel torn, and I feel hurt. I feel humiliated because you're selling this, but it is not what it is. So my simplest answer to what is being cherry picked, what is unpalatable, it's all of it, because it isn't. And I think the only way we could attempt to fix it right now, because you have to do it, is is education. You have to be educated, and it's not my job to go and educate someone who does not feel invested because of their rooting in the culture. But I think education begins with us, the South Asian community. We need to be educated in our own culture. We need to be educated in our own history. Otherwise, we'd just be reacting and just shooting the gun at something when we don't really know what it is, because many of us are also buying this sterilized version, right? We need to go back to our roots. If we have to speak about something, I need to have some source backing me up to say, this is what you're speaking. This is the truth. We need to connect with what our truth is before anyone else has or takes space or platforms themselves to speak about our culture. So
when you
I
say
think that is important.
when you say educating, is it the yoga teacher training?
You wish. No, but if the yoga teacher training is going to include a lot of that, then maybe that's a start. Maybe your yoga teacher trainings, if they are going to include a very strong, a holistic view of Indian history, of Indian politics, of mythology, of the scriptures, of the sutras, and not just 200 hours of learning how to do all the different series of asanas, then maybe that's a start. So it could begin from there, but it shouldn't end there.
So if it's not the yoga teacher training, then what would be a good start? Or, is there a particular book that you would recommend to start off with, or a particular program, or I don't know. I know there's so much to do.
Yeah,
that's why I kind of want to give them a starting point.
It's so difficult to go through books, because which books would they read? Would they read it in English and then buy someone's translation? No. Are they going to invest the time to go and study Sanskritam? Will they do that? If they do that and then take the time to say, let me understand this language and then try to infer for myself what it means, maybe they'll be doing that effort. But otherwise, I think we can begin with our elders. Okay, we can begin with our families, but also hold the space that not all of our elders or our families know the scriptural truth of it, because we come from our own individual experiences. It's subjective. So there are teachers who are teachers, they are gurus, and that is a calling. That is your investment of time to go and look for that, like Kundan said, if the teacher accepts you. I have been there. I know that sometimes I have spent, weeks before sending out the message asking, can you teach me? And it comes with a lot of fear, and it's not a patriarchal fear. It's just, am I eligible? Am I eligible to start this? And capitalism allows all of us to believe that we are eligible because we've got the money to pay for the training, right? Mm-hmm. But many teachers will not take any money from you. They'll teach you because it's their dharma to convey the wisdom, and because you are ready to receive that wisdom. So humility is where we need to start before we want to go and learn something deeper about it. I don't have any book list to recommend that at the moment.
That's fine. No, that's a great answer. Yeah, Shreena, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump on the point that Luvena made, which was really great about capitalism, is capitalism tells us that we can own anything, we can have anything. I often, when I talk to my students, they have different stickers on the back of their laptop, so I use that as an example. If they want a sticker that, makes it look like, makes the apple look like Snow White, they can Google that and buy that, right? Any sticker you want, you can buy. And I think when white people in particular are told that, no, you can't really buy this, or you can't do this, they, for lack of a better word, while out a little bit, right? And because capitalism has kind of disciplined our bodies from such a young age that anything we want, we can buy. right? As long as we have enough money, access, privilege, etc. And then when you say no, they don't like that very much. And so I think that's one of the kind of things that we have to work on in terms of dismantling, is that you can't own everything, and that not everything is to be owned, right? To start questioning that as well, you know, and in that space, things can really, I think, flourish. But right now we're not there yet.
What will it take to get there?
Oh gosh. I mean, imagining the world, right?
The first step. What would be that first step to get there?
The first step, I would say, having a system. I would actually, as an educator, as someone who I think tries to teach in a kind of anti-oppressive, anti-racist, anti-colonial way, is to start getting people to realize that they too have, oh, that's not the way I say it. Start getting people to realize that they're white, that matters, right? And what does that mean when they're white? How are the ways in which they're complicit in all of it, right? And so this semester in my race and religion class, I'm assigning a book called Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. And it's a book that has journal prompts and takes us through all the many facets of white supremacy. And, you know, my class is mixed with brown, black, and Indigenous and white students. I'm having everyone read it because, as I said, we're complicit in the system too, and we can always learn more. But if we can get them to just first realize that they're white and that means something, that they have power in some way and that they wield that every day, then I think we can start taking smaller steps forward.
So can colored people be white? Like have those attributes of...
Right. I mean, I look at the South Asian community in the United States in particular, as well as the Euro, Latino, Latinx community, and we aspire to whiteness through our careers, right? The right careers, through our beauty standards, through colorism, and through the supporting of certain values, right? That we're quote unquote good immigrants as opposed to bad immigrants, that we're educated, all of that stuff. I think that we aspire to whiteness. I don't know that someone my color could ever be white, but there are, you know, really fair South Asians, really fair Euro Latinx people that will, like, I'm just gonna say it, like Nikki Haley, right? That will play white when they can, and will play the Indian card when it's suitable for them.
Right.
So yeah, I think, but you know, Nimrata, not Nikki, right? Still has a lot to answer for, and in many ways is at least complicit, implicitly and explicitly, in a larger system of white supremacy culture.
You know, I didn't know that until you just mentioned about, what's her real name? It's not Nikki?
It's Nimruta.
Nimruta. See, I did not know that. Interesting.
Which is not related to the word name Nikki at all. So she completely whitewashed her name. Like, my middle name is Nikita, right? And you can see like the Nikita to Nikki.
Right.
You know, because like Indians play around with words, and we shorthand. Like, a lot of my friends will call me Shri because Shreena is, you know,
too long.
And you know, they play around with my name and call me Shri, right. You know, but Nimrata is really different than Nikki, and so she did that, you know, on purpose. Same with Bobby Jindal. His name is I think it starts with an H. So Bobby, you know, was on purpose with him, even though, like, I think there was a movie back in the day called Bobby, you know, and my one Mossy loves that movie so much that we nicknamed her Bobby for that reason, because she watched that movie over and over and over again, right? I don't think Bobby Jindal did it for that reason.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Okay, so Kundan.
Varun, if I may just add,
Please.
Shreena, I think, and Kundan, you may also know because you said you've got some Punjabi roots as well. So in a lot of Punjabis actually, and they have Bobby as a name, so they as one of the nicknames along with it. So I don't know if that's how Bobby Jindal got his name, but a lot of them. Okay, all right. So there, but yeah.
Yeah. So, Kundan, yeah, I know you have something to add. Go ahead, add.
Yeah, I had a few things to add, but
Please.
like with the latest thing that Shreena said, I also wanted to add to that first, that the distinction between race and ethnicity, right? So black, brown, and white are races and they're racial constructs, and they're completely made up, but with real devastating consequences. And then ethnicity is what's actually real. But the problem with whiteness is that it keeps assimilating more and more ethnicities. And so, for example, originally, even among Europeans, the Irish and the Italians were not considered white. It was basically only the Anglo-Saxons that were considered white, and then they expanded the definition to assimilate the other Europeans first with the Irish and the Italians, and then the Spanish and the Portuguese, at least in the United States and Canada. And then slowly over time, they also assimilated the white passing Jews. And at this point, they're just considered white, not white passing. And then in the last few decades, even Syrians, Armenians, and Turks are considered white. For example, most people don't even know that Steve Jobs was Syrian, uh, but he was adopted by white parents, and then he had one white biological parent and one Syrian biological parent. And he went by the name Steve Jobs, and he's totally, white passing. And at this point, he's just considered white, not even white passing. And so there's this phenomenon of, content assimilation. And the next ethnicities that are assimilating are now a lot of people from South and Central America that they're starting to assimilate because some of them actually also have actual European heritage as well, because they're the colonizers. There's where we have the trigger warning, right? The colonizers assaulted and raped their ancestors, and which is why they have that white passing ness now. And I'm concerned that even that they might start assimilating South Asians. I also want to make distinctions between not to put all Asians in a monolith, right? There are even the so-called model minority myth where I wouldn't include Vietnamese or uh, Cambodians, for example, in that category of being very wealthy or well-off or even white adjacent. So in the activism community, we make distinctions between white passing, and white adjacent, which is basically light skin privilege, which is what Indians, I think, are. We are not white passing, but we're white adjacent at this point, is what we are. So I wanted to speak to that first. And the other thing about the responsibility, right, of us Indians, which is speaking to what Luvena also said. For example, with the word mandala, right, which is from both Hindu and Buddhist lineages, there are a lot of white people who will make a random circle, and some of it might even be very intricate, but it doesn't matter. They just call it a mandala, And I'm saying even I, as an ethnic indigenous Hindu and Buddhist, I have my circle paintings too. Even I don't call them mandalas because I know the centuries and generations of lineage and teachings and rituals and processes that are passed down to make an actual mandala, and I don't have that lineage or teachings to do that. So I just call my circle paintings sacred circles at best, because there is some intention to it, but the intentions don't matter either, So for some reason, white people, especially spiritual white people, are big on intentions. Like, it's kind of ridiculous. And the third point I wanted to make is one of the number one weapons in terms of narrative warfare is the false binary or the false dichotomy of demonization versus exotification or fetishizing us. So on the demonizing side, this is how they kill our cultural roots, by demonizing the actual people. Now, in the past, they were very overt, they called us thugs. And, speaking of white women worshiping, or not even worshiping, but whatever they do with Kali, it's very ironic because the British killed 10 million Kali worshipping indigenous people in a genocide. They called them thugs and criminalized them, including newborn babies, and they even killed the newborn babies. And it was a genocide, and one of the largest genocides in history that most people don't talk about. Now, in modern times, the demonization is more covert, So let's take casteism, for example. Yes, it's a very big problem, but what the American left is doing right now, in conjunction with a lot of South Asians who don't understand the intricate histories, is they're blaming the whole of Hinduism on casteism. And some of them are even saying that Hinduism cannot be reformed, that you have to end the whole of Hinduism to end casteism, that Hindus have to stop being Hindus. And there was even an article put out recently that said Hindus must convert to Islam in order to show solidarity. What the? It's, that level of demonization is happening. And then on the other side, when they can't demonize us, they exotify us as these magical fairies who can do no wrong. And where, that's when they say, oh, we learn from ancient teachings, as if ancient people did not no wrong whatsoever. They made several mistakes too. So that's what that does, is that we're not allowed to be fully human. We're not allowed to have flaws. We're not allowed to have imperfections. We're not entirely perfect human beings. We have good qualities and flaws. I have good qualities and flaws. I have many flaws. And I'm a flawed human being. And that we're not allowed. But white people are allowed to have all of these flaws. They can shoot somebody and people say, oh, he was an aspiring cop. It's like, what the, right?
Wow, very, very interesting points that you bring up. In the first point, you were talking about, yeah, I want to get to, we mentioned appropriation and appreciation, and there's kind of a fine line between that. How can we tell when someone is appropriating versus appreciating? And what's that, how do we know that it's in the appreciation box, if you want to call it? Kundan, what have you seen?
I sometimes don't even want to get to them, because any inch that I give them, they use that as an excuse to take a mile, right? And even so-called tourism sometimes, right? Like they would go to Bali, which is a mixture of indigenous culture with Hinduism as well. And then they would call it, they're recolonizing Bali basically via this so-called tourism. And when we try to hold them accountable, they say, oh, but we're helping them, we're helping the economy. Well, if you want to help them, just give them the money. Don't expect a transaction, right? That's the capitalist mindset, because you stole their resources through economic warfare anyways. There's a whole book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where they're waging economic warfare against the global south. So why don't you try to stop that instead of so-called helping the economy, right? Just give away the money. And so as far as appreciation, sometimes they use buying from an indigenous culture, or even from a Hindu, some of their artifacts, right? They don't recognize that some indigenous people are forced to sell their own culture because of the economic warfare against them. So it's better if that's not appreciation either. Just give the money if you care so much. Like just give it away, because it's not really their money anyway. I mean, it's not white people's money. They stole, labor from Black people. They stole the land from Native Indigenous. and they're stealing from the entire global south through the economic warfare. So it's not their money anyways. So just give it back. It's just giving back. It's not even charity. There's also a great TED talk if people want to follow up by Malance Bart Williams called Change Your Channel, which speaks to how the economic warfare against Africans in Africa. So appreciation, a big part of appreciation might be consent. And even with consent, you have to be careful because some of us go through what's known as the fawn trauma response, which is the fourth trauma response not often talked about, which is appeasing our oppressor, right? So for example, in a thread that I saw, there was a South Asian man who said, don't say namaste to us, and then there was a white woman who was very angry and said, oh, but my Nepalese coworker allows me to say it and wants me to say it, and we say it all the time. It's a sign of respect. And we really had to help her unpack that and be like, wait, first of all, you're tokenizing your Nepalese coworker. And second of all, again, we're not a monolith. That person may allow you, but this person is saying no. Can you respect that and be consensual about that, right? And then third of all, even your Nepalese coworker might be scared to say no to you. And that's when we get into the difference between willingness and consent, right? Or between comfort and enjoyment, where somebody might be willing to do something, but they're not, that doesn't mean they're consenting. It's like, have you ever worked at a job that you hated, right? You were willing to work at it, but are you really consenting to that? Are you really enjoying it? That's not consent either. So yeah, I almost feel like just don't do it. Like just err on the side of just not doing it, when it comes to that question for me. Like,
Luvena, what would you say about that line between appreciation and appropriation?
I find it very tricky, but I really can't tell. Like Kundan said, it's like if we like there have been times when, say, for example, we have white guests at an Indian wedding, and then they would wear say Indian ethnic clothes, and then we say, okay, you're being a part of everything. And in India, I've seen many people, the Indian people, find that very heartwarming, and they actually say, do this, add bangles and put a bindi, and they do the entire thing, and we don't know who's the actual bride there. But when it comes to outside of India or outside of it, then I find it tricky, because when you're in India, it might be appreciation in some contexts, but then context always matters. So, there's never a one answer for everything. And sometimes, in one context, it might be okay, but then in another one, it might be just so wrong. I think I will tend to also agree with what Kundan said, or on the side of not doing it, not even caution, just don't do it. And yeah, I think not doing doing it is safer.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so I'm going to ask one last question. So if anybody in the audience has any more questions, feel free to ask it right now. I'm going to go with the last question, which is, I'll start with Shreena. It's the same question for everybody. Any last words of advice? Anything else that maybe we haven't covered that you'd like people to know? Can you share something for the audience?
Well, I guess what I would say is, when I look at yoga as something that helps people, especially when I look at something like trauma-informed yoga or yoga for racial healing, it has been wonderful for people. It has helped people get over sexual assaults, PTSD, right? So I'm one person that will never tell anyone not to do yoga. We live in such an unhealthy world that anything that brings us health, I think, is a good thing. And, maybe our ancestors knew something about healing that we don't necessarily know. I guess what I would say is, at the same time, though, at least acknowledge where it comes from, and acknowledge that it's a system that you only have a small slice of. you know. But I also think that the colonization that we experienced as South Asians is very different than, let's say, the colonization of Native Americans. So there are Native Americans in terms of cultural appropriation that'll say, no, our ghost dance is private, you cannot come, right? And I think, again, like Luvena said, context is everything. And so you have to look at the different histories, the different contexts, in order to kind of make a judgment call. And, you know, for example, I'm sitting on Anishinaabe land that was unceded in the Treaty of 1819. And I work at a land grant university that took land from the Anishinaabe people, specifically in this area, the Ojibwe, and made a university out of it, right? So I think you have to look at the specific things. Like Black people say, please don't use cornrows. Don't use them. Right? So, as Luvena said, context is everything.
Context. All right. Thank you so much, Shreena. Actually, we have a question from Sophia. She wants to have more details of the article that you wrote, Shreena. Sorry, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I said I'll just put it in the chat just now. I'll
Perfect.
look for it and yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Shreena. Kundan, any last words of advice, maybe a different perspective that we haven't covered, some insights that you would like to share?
Last words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would suggest, especially if there's a white person watching, to really study the real history of what is happening even to your own country, the United States, where a lot of, as well as what the history of other countries as well, especially the history of whiteness, and especially the economic warfare that's constantly being waged. Watch documentaries such as 13th, which shows that slavery never really ended; it just changed form into prison slavery. And I say study history because, for example, apartheid didn't even end in South Africa until 1994, and Angola, which is a country in Africa, didn't even receive its independence until 1975. And it's very, especially you study the independent states of different countries in the global south, especially Africa, because I really want people to do that, because when white people claim, especially liberals claim they're not racist, even though all white people are racist, they're ignoring the fact that how recent colonization ended in some countries, how recent entirely racist systems such as apartheid ended just 20 or 30 years ago. 1975 in Angola, which is like just 40 years ago. And that's just one or two generations. Meanwhile, there's 400 years of slavery, right? 400 years of colonization at least. And if you count, what the Roman Empire did and all that, some people even argue that colonization goes as far back as the 1300 years actually. So yeah, really study that, like, especially when it comes to appropriation, and even this question of appropriation versus appreciation. Like, speaking of context, study the historical context in which you as a white person are asking, and why are you asking this? Are you doing this to keep your systemic power and to keep doing whatever you want, rather than respect the requests of the people of the culture? Or are you doing that because you truly want to have a connection and share in the culture? Like, why are you doing that, right? And I talk all the time about intention versus impact, but this is where intention might matter a little bit, right? What is your motivation behind even asking that question, right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Kundan. That is a very important point, understanding why you want to get into something. Are you just following a movement that's shiny, or do you actually want to learn something from it and have some sort of inner transformation from it? Definitely a very important point. Luvena, the same question for you. Any last words of advice, any last tips, anything that you can add?
I've got two things. I think I'll build on everything that Shreena and Kundan have said. One, definitely do the study on history, because, and not just biased history. You have to look at history as it's written on both sides of the event. And more importantly, that South Asians or even Indians or the diaspora are not a monolith. We all come with our own subjective experiences. So if you look at, or you look up to, or look to any South Asian for an experience, that we also understand that it might be their subjective experience and their subjective perspective as well. So to look at the whole picture, to look at everything that's there. So it's not just that we take permission from one South Asian when it might actually be wrongful and harmful to many others. Just because one person sees it in a particular way, it might not be the right thing to do. So education, and actually my more deeper call is to all of our South Asian, siblings around the world, to really take this upon ourselves, to really know our culture, to know our history, and to really own our being of who we are, because unless we stand really true to who we are, there's no point pointing a finger at someone else, because we won't be able to stand up to it. But for everything else, I think we've all shared a lot in here today.
That last point, I can share that growing up, I wasn't exposed to yoga. I wasn't exposed to meditation in the form of meditation. So coming to America, when I saw this whole yoga movement and yoga pants and Lululemon and all of these different companies, different billion-dollar brands being built around yoga, I thought to myself, is this really what yoga truly is? And I didn't know, because I hadn't studied that history. I hadn't studied, what our ancestors had created. And because of that, I couldn't answer that question for myself. So I had to go back and read, okay, what is truly yoga, and educate myself, even though I didn't go as deep as you guys have, but kind of got a better perspective of what yoga truly is. But I only got that once I dove deeper into these topics. So very, with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, Shreena, Luvena, and Kundan, for sharing your stories and for engaging us in this very insightful discussion. I want to thank our audience for asking your questions and for the participation. If anybody's interested, I'm going to be posting this link up on YouTube, or posting this video up on YouTube over the today and tomorrow. So I'll send out this link to everybody. So please share it with anybody who's interested, with anybody who wants to learn, or anybody wants to, anybody you think who could gain from this conversation. If you guys have any comments about these conversations or any topics that you'd like to see, please definitely let me know, and I will do my best to include it in a future conversation. Our next conversation is 2 weeks from today, September 17th, and it is on immigrating to the US. So join us on Facebook and Zoom, the same setup as we have today. That's all from my end. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you our panelists again. Love and abundance to everybody.
Thank you.
Hope you have a fantastic day.